The blood was a question the land refused to answer. It coiled on the frost-bitten shale of the creek bed, a dark, arterial thread leading away from a dead horse and into the skeletal willows. Corbin saw it from the ridge, a stain against the pale dawn. He was a man who knew the many languages of blood, the bright, frothy spray of a lung-shot deer, the dark, slow seep of a gut-shot man. This was different. This was a trail of finality, a slow-bleeding prayer whispered into the frozen earth. He carried a rifle, but his hands were gloved against the bite of the air, not in anticipation of a fight. His world had shrunk to this cabin, these trap lines, this unforgiving expanse of the Llano Estacado. It was a self-imposed exile, a penance paid not to God, but to the ghosts that rode the wind here. He'd learned the silence of this place. Let it scour him clean of old allegiances and older shamas. Or so he'd thought. Following the trail was a fool's errand. This was Comancheria, or what was left of it. The treaties were ink on paper in a faraway city, but here, on the skin of the earth, the only law was memory and the cold steel of survival. A blood trail like this could belong to a wounded warrior, and helping him would be an act of war against the men who wounded him. It could be an outcast, and helping him would invite the wrath of his own people. Or it could be nothing, a coyote's kill, a trick of the light. But the horse was a pinto, its markings like a map of forgotten territories, a Comanche pony. And the blood was too human. He moved with the practiced quiet of a man who has spent years trying to erase his own footsteps from the world. Down the scree slope, his boots dislodging pebbles that sounded like gunshots in the immense quiet. The air was thin and sharp, smelling of iron and damp stone. He knelt by the horse. It was still warm. One of its eyes was open, a black, glassy orb reflecting the vast and different sky. A single arrow fletched with hawk feathers was buried deep in its flank. Not an army arrow. This was an affair between tribes or within one. Corbin rose and followed the crimson path. It led him into a thicket of salt cedar, their branches brittle and gray. There, wedged between two rust-colored boulders, was the source. Not a warrior, not a man, a boy. He couldn't have been more than 10 winters old. He was curled on his side, a small, dark knot of buckskin and pain. One leg was bent at an unnatural angle, the bone a jagged white shard piercing the hide of his leggings, but the blood, the river of it, came from his side, a deep, ragged gash that pulsed weakly with every shallow breath. He had pulled himself here, dragged his broken body into this small cleft of rock, to die alone. Corbin's own breath caught in his throat, a shard of ice. He saw not a Comanche, not an enemy, not a threat. He saw the ghost of his own son, Thomas. Pale and still in a pine box, taken by a fever the preacher had called God's will, Corbin had called it a failure of his own. The boy's eyes fluttered open. They were black, bottomless, and held no fear. Only a profound, ancient weariness. He looked at Corbin, at the pale skin and the hard lines of a life lived in regret, and a flicker of something passed through them. Not recognition, judgment. Corbin slowly unslung his rifle, laying it on the ground, a gesture of peace that felt pitifully inadequate. He unhooked his canteen, his movements slow, deliberate. "Water," he said. The word was a ruin in his throat, rough from disuse. The boy did not move. His gaze was fixed on something over Corbin's shoulder, something in the vast emptiness of the plains. He was listening to a sound Corbin couldn't hear. Corbin knew the cost. He knew what it meant to touch one of them, to interfere. It was a debt that would be collected. The soldiers would call him a traitor. The settlers would call him an Indian lover, a fate worse than death. The Comanche. He didn't know what they would do. They might see it as an offense, a white men laying hands on their sacred dying. He looked down at his own hands, calloused and scarred. Hands that had once held reins, a branding iron, a soldier's carbine. hands that had held his wife's face as she wept for their boy. He looked at the child, bleeding his life into the soil of his ancestors, and the choice was not a choice at all. It was the only step left on a long road of atonement. He uncorked the canteen, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He shuffled closer, the frozen ground crunching under his knees. He lifted the boy's head, feeling the feverish heat of his skin. The boy's lips parted, and a sound came out, not a word, but a dry, rasping whisper. A name, maybe, a name not meant for Corbin's ears. He tilted the canteen, and a trickle of water ran over the boy's cracked lips. The boy swallowed, a convulsive, pained motion. His eyes closed. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind sighing through the canyons, a lonely, keening sound. Then, from high above, a single piercing cry. A red-tailed hawk circling in the gray dome of the sky. Corbin gathered the boy into his arms. He was lighter than a sack of flour, a fragile collection of bones and spirit. As he lifted him, a small beaded pouch fell from the boy's belt. Corbin tucked it back, his fingers brushing against the cold, smooth stone of a talisman within. He stood, the boy a profound weight against his soul, and began the long, slow walk back to his cabin, leaving a trail of his own footprints alongside the fading blood. The deck was now his, and the dawn was coming. The cabin was a testament to a stripped-down life, a single room of hewn pine logs, chinked with mud and memory. It smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and the faint, lingering scent of lavender from a sachet his wife Elspeth had made years ago, a scent he could never bring himself to discard. It was a place of ghosts, and he had just brought a new one in. He laid the boy on his own cot, the only soft place in the entire structure. The child's breathing was a faint, ragged whisper against the oppressive silence. Corbin lit another lantern, the flickering yellow light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. In this light, the boy looked even smaller, his dark hair matted with sweat and blood, his face a mask of serene suffering. Corbin was no healer, but he was a man of the frontier. He knew wounds. He cut away the buckskin leggings with his skinning knife, the blade sharp enough to shave with. The break was clean, a splintered tibia. Setting it would be an agony for the boy and a trial for him. But the gash in his side was the real killer. It was deep, edged with the blackening of infection. An arrow wound, by the look of it. Someone had gotten their arrow back and left the hole. He set a pot of water to boil over the fire, his movements mechanical. His mind was a maelstrom. He was a man running from his past, and he had just carried it through his front door. He had been a scout, just for a season, for the 4th Cavalry. A job he took after Elspeth and Thomas were gone, when the silence of his homestead screamed louder than any Comanche war cry. He thought the discipline, the hard riding, the clear lines of duty would cauterize the wound in his soul. It had only deepened it. He remembered the day he quit. The day they rode on the winter camp at Red Bluffs. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. The official report called it a decisive victory, scattering a band of renegade Quahati. Corbin called it the murder of women and children huddled in their lodges against a bitter wind. He remembered the smell of burning hides and gunpowder, the high, thin screams that were cut short. He remembered seeing a young woman, her face a defiant mask of terror, clutching a baby to her chest as a corporal rode her down. Corbin had turned his horse that day and ridden away, the jeers of the other scouts following him like hornets. He'd been branded a coward and a deserter. He'd sold his farm, bought this small, forgotten patch of nowhere, and tried to become a ghost himself. Now a child of those very people lay on his cot. The boy stirred, his eyes opening. They weren't dazed or confused. They were lucid, ancient. He stared at the fire, and his body went rigid. A low moan escaped his lips, a sound of such profound grief that it shook Corbin to his core. He wasn't just looking at the flames in the hearth. He was remembering a different fire, a fire that had consumed his world. Corbin moved to the boys, sighed. "Easy now," he murmured, the words feeling hollow and useless. The boy's gaze shifted to him. There was no accusation, not yet, just a deep, unnerving watchfulness. He did not speak. He did not cry out. He simply endured, a silent vessel of his people's pain. Two ghosts under one roof, their wounds separated by culture and history, but united by the common language of loss. Corbin found a small buckskin pouch tied to the boy's belt. He hesitated, knowing it was a violation, but he needed to know what he was dealing with. Inside, he found a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched, and something else. A tattered piece of blue wool, a piece of a soldier's coat. His blood ran cold. The boy had been carrying a piece of his own destruction. Was it a trophy, a memory, a curse? He set about his grim work. He gave the boy a strip of leather to bite down on, a poor substitute for whiskey or laudanum. "This will hurt," Corbin said, his voice low. "I am sorry for it." The boy looked at him, then deliberately spat the leather out. He would meet the pain raw, with his eyes open. It was a display of pride so fierce it was almost terrifying. When Corbin pulled the bone into place, a single sharp gasp escaped the boy's lips. His body arched, his hands clenched into fists, but he made no other sound. Tears streamed from the corners of his eyes, but his gaze remained fixed on the ceiling beams, as if he were watching the stars through the roof. Corbin worked quickly, his hands surprisingly steady. He splinted the leg with two flat pieces of wood and strips of cloth. Then he turned to the wound in his side. He cleaned it with boiled water and the last of his whiskey, a sacrifice that pained him in more ways than one. The boy flinched at the sting, but his silence held. It was a shield, a fortress. Corbin packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow and crushed willow bark, remedies Elspeth had taught him, her voice a gentle echo in the grim silence of the cabin. He bandaged the boy with strips from a clean shirt, his own. As he worked, he felt the boy's eyes on him, studying his face, his hands, the guilt etched into the lines around his eyes. They were two enemies, two strangers, locked in an intimacy born of violence and necessity. The air between them was thicker than smoke, charged with unspoken history and the deafening roar of their shared silence. When he was done, he covered the boy with a thick wool blanket. The child's fever was rising. Corbin sat in the single wooden chair, the rifle on his lap, and prepared to wait. He wasn't waiting for the boy to heal. He was waiting for the collection of the debt. He was waiting for the riders he knew would come. He had touched one of theirs. And in this land, a touch was a claim, an accusation, a promise. He watched the fire, and in its dancing flames, he saw the faces of the dead at Red Bluffs. He saw the face of his son, and he saw the dark, judging eyes of the boy on the cot, a silent witness to a reckoning that had been a long time coming. The silence in the cabin wasn't peace. It was the quiet at the heart of a storm. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of quiet ritual and watchful tension. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the cabin, the fire, and the feverish breathing of the boy. Corbin moved like a man in a dream, his actions dictated by a purpose that felt both foreign and deeply familiar. He fed the fire, melted snow for water, and tended to the boy's wounds with a reverence he hadn't felt since he'd tended to his own child. The boy's fever raged. He drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering in a language that sounded like stones rolling in a riverbed. Corbin would wipe his brow with a cool, damp cloth, and in those moments of delirium, the boy's fierce guard would drop. He would whimper, not in pain, but in loss, calling out names that hung in the air like smoke. One name he repeated more than others, A soft, sorrowful whisper. Isatekoru. Corbin did not sleep. He sat in his chair, watching, listening. He remembered the soldier's coat, the tattered blue wool he'd found on the boy. One night, while the boy was lost in fever dreams, Corbin took the scrap of cloth outside. The moon was a cold, silver disk in a star-dusted sky. He dug a small hole in the frozen earth behind the cabin and buried the cloth. It felt like burying a piece of his own past, his own sin, an offering to an unforgiving God. On the third day, the fever broke. Corbin woke from a brief, fitful doze to find the boy sitting up, propped against the wall, his dark eyes clear and calm. He was looking at Corbin, not with judgment, but with an unnerving, analytical curiosity. Corbin offered him a bowl of thin broth, made from a rabbit he'd snared. The boy took it without a word, his small hands surprisingly steady. He drank slowly, deliberately, as if committing the taste and texture to memory. When he was done, he handed the empty bowl back, a silent transaction. An acceptance, not of friendship, but of a temporary truce. The silence between them changed. It was no longer a clash of two solitudes, but something more fragile, more complex. It became a shared space. Corbin would mend his traps by the fire, and the boy would watch, his eyes following the intricate movements of Corbin's hands. One afternoon, the boy gestured toward the hearth with his chin. He pointed to the pile of gray ash from the fire. Corbin, understanding, scooped a handful of cool ash onto a flat piece of bark and placed it on the cot beside him. The boy dipped a finger into the ash. With slow, deliberate strokes, he began to draw on the wooden floor beside the cot. He did not draw a horse, or a warrior, or a buffalo. He drew a spiral, an intricate, swirling pattern that seemed to pull the eye inward. It was a symbol Corbin had seen carved on canyon walls, a symbol of journey, of life, of the world itself. Then, outside the spiral, he drew a single stylized bird. A hawk. Corbin felt a chill crawl up his spine. The hawk that had cried out when he found him. The boy looked up, his eyes meeting Corbin's. He held his gaze for a long moment, and Corbin felt as if the child were looking straight through his flesh, into the hollowed-out chambers of his soul. Then the boy began to hum. It was not a child's tune. It was a low, resonant chant, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was ancient, mournful, and yet filled with a strange power. The notes vibrated in the small cabin, making the air feel thick and heavy. Corbin realized with a jolt that the boy wasn't humming for him. He wasn't humming for comfort. He was humming for someone who was listening, someone far away. The quiet had been broken. This was the signal. The dreamlike state of their shared solitude was ending. This was the quiet before the storm. Corbin went to the door and looked out. The sun was setting, painting the vast, empty landscape in hues of orange and blood red. The wind was still. The world held its breath. He knew with a certainty that, settled deep in his bones, that they would be here by morning. The boy's song was a summons. He had been nursed back not just to life, but to his purpose. He turned back and looked at the boy. The child had finished his humming. He lay back down, his small frame looking almost lost in the heavy wool blanket. He closed his eyes, as if his work were done. Corbin checked the load in his rifle, a habit he'd never lost, but he knew it was useless. This wouldn't be a fight of bullets and powder. It would be a reckoning of spirits. He had taken something that did not belong to him, and now its owners were coming to reclaim it. He had trespassed, not on land, but in a story that had begun long before he was born, and would continue long after he was gone. He had thought he was saving a life, but he was beginning to understand he had only been a chapter in its telling. And the price of that chapter was about to be paid. The dawn did not break. It seeped. A pale, ethereal fog rolled in from the plains, swallowing the horizon and muffling the world in a shroud of gray. It clung to the pines and blurred the edges of the earth and sky, creating a world without landmarks, a place outside of time. Corbin stood on the small porch of his cabin, a tin cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. He hadn't slept. He had watched the fog gather, knowing it was a curtain rising on the final act. The boy, Tatsuki, was awake inside, silent, as if he too were listening to the world draw a single collective breath. Then he saw him, a lone rider, sitting motionless on a dark horse at the edge of the fog, no more than 200 yards away. He was a silhouette, a specter etched in charcoal against the gray. He did not move. He did not signal. He simply was. A sentinel. Corbin's heart, which had been a frantic drum all night, settled into a slow, heavy beat. The waiting was over. He stayed where he was, making no move for the rifle propped just inside the door. This was not a moment for weapons. It was a moment for witness. As the fog swirled and thinned in the nascent light, another rider appeared beside the first, then 3 more, then 10. They did not ride into view. They materialized from the mist. Silent as ghosts, their ponies making no sound on the damp earth. They formed a loose, silent semicircle facing the cabin, their presence a crushing weight on the small clearing. They were armed with bows and lances, a few with old rifles, but the weapons were held at rest. This was not a war party. It was something far more intimidating. It was a tribunal. The air grew thick, heavy with the unsprouting power of their collective will. The birds were silent. The wind was dead. Every beat of Corbin's heart felt like a thunderclap. Then the riders parted. A man on foot emerged from their ranks. He was tall and broad, his face a mask of granite and grief, etched with the lines of a hard-lived authority. He wore a simple buckskin shirt and leggings, unadorned except for a single eagle feather tied in his long gray-streaked hair. His eyes were fixed on Corbin, and they held the accumulated sorrow and fury of a generation. Beside him, walking with a hand on the tall man's arm, was another boy, a contemporary of the one inside, his face a stoic mask. This was the chief, the father. He stopped 50 feet from the porch, the silent riders fanning out behind him. Like a living extension of his own body, history, power, judgment, all stood before Corbin's door. For a long minute, no one moved. The chief's gaze swept over Corbin, the cabin, the thin curl of smoke from the chimney. It was not a look of hatred, but of assessment, as if he were reading the soul of the man and the story of the place. Finally, he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it carried across the clearing with the resonance of stone grinding on stone. It was the voice of the land itself. You have one of ours. The words were not a question. They were a statement. A fact, an indictment, and a claim all in one. Corbin felt the weight of that simple sentence pressed down on him, the weight of red bluffs, of his desertion, of his hollowed-out life. He could have offered excuses. He could have said he saved the boy. He could have pleaded for his life. But he knew, in that moment, that his life was not the currency being traded here. Something else was. Slowly, deliberately, Corbin set his coffee cup on the porch rail. He stepped down from the single wooden step onto the damp earth. He did not look away from the chief's unflinching gaze. He walked forward 10 paces into the clearing, into the space between his world and theirs. And then he did the only thing that felt true. He dropped to one knee, bowing his head. It was not an act of fear. It was not the submission of a captive. It was the atonement of a penitent. It was an admission of a debt he could never hope to repay, a silent confession offered to the people his own had so grievously wronged. He knelt in the mud and the fog, a solitary broken man before the silent judgment of an entire nation, and waited. The thunder of his own heartbeat was the only sound in a world that had gone profoundly, terribly quiet. The chief Tasawi did not move. His eyes, like chips of obsidian, remained fixed on the kneeling white man. The 70 riders behind him were as still as the stones on the plains, their silence a living, breathing entity. The air crackled with it. Tsawi spoke again. His voice a low rumble. "Rise." Corbin pushed himself to his feet, his joints stiff, mud clinging to his trousers. He kept his eyes lowered, a sign of respect, of supplication. "You are the one they call the ghost of the Llano," Tsawi stated, not a question. They knew. Him. They had been watching him, perhaps for years, this solitary man living on the edge of their world, a man who had walked away from his own kind. "I am," Corbin answered, his voice hoarse. "My son is in your lodge," Tsawi said, his voice tightening almost imperceptibly on the word son. "His name is Tiki. He is my firstborn." Corbin's heart seized. Not just a boy, the son of the chief. The air, the gash in the boy's side, now felt like a wound in Corbin's own soul. "He is alive," Corbin said. "His leg is broken, but the fever has passed." Just then, the cabin door creaked open. Tupti stood there, leaning heavily on the doorframe, his small frame wrapped in Corbin's thick wool blanket. His face was pale and drawn, but his eyes were bright, burning, with an intensity that belied his age. He looked at his father, and a silent communication passed between them. A current of love and relief and shared knowledge that made Corbin feel like an intruder in his own home. Tsawi's granite face softened for a fraction of a second as he looked at his son. Then his gaze returned to Corbin, harder than before. "We followed his trail. We found the place where his horse fell. We found the tracks of the Ute who shot him. And we found your tracks leading away from his blood." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Why, it was the question that decided everything. Life or death. War or something else. "I saw a child," Corbin said, his voice raw with a truth he hadn't fully admitted even to himself. "I saw my own son, whom I lost to the fever. I could not leave him." Tsawi's eyes narrowed. He took a step forward. "You were a scout, for the Bluecoats. You rode with the men who butchered our women and children at the Red Bluffs." The accusation landed like a physical blow. The first twist of the knife. Corbin flinched, the shame of it washing over him, fresh and scalding as the day it happened. He could see it in his mind, the smoke, the snow-stained red, the sound of a woman screaming a name. Isitahwaru, the name Toki had whispered in his fever. Corbin's breath hitched. He looked from Tsawi to the boy in the doorway. He finally understood. "His mother," Corbin whispered, the words tasting like ash. She was my wife," Tsawi said, his voice cracking with a grief so profound it seemed to shake the very ground. "Her name was Isitahwaru. She who remembers the sun. You were there. You watched her die." Corbin closed his eyes, the memory searing his eyelids. He had not held the gun, but he had led them there. His guilt was absolute. He dropped his gaze to the muddy earth. "Yes," he said, the word a confession, a surrender. "I was there. I watched it happen. And I rode away that day and never went back. It is the sin I carry. It is why I am here. If you have come to kill me, I will not raise a hand." "It is your right." He expected the order, the arrow, the lance. He had confessed to his part in the murder of their chief's wife, the boy's mother. There was no other possible outcome. He braced himself for the end. But the blow never came. Instead, he heard a soft shuffling sound. He looked up. Toki, the boy, was walking toward him. He moved with a painful limp, dragging his splinted leg, his face a mask of determined effort. He did not look at his father. His eyes, ancient and luminous, were locked on Corbin. He stopped directly in front of the kneeling man. The 70 riders watched. The chief watched. The world held its breath. This was the second twist, the one Corbin could never have foreseen. Tiki was not just a boy. Tasawi's voice was low, filled with a strange awe. "He is a Nami Voip, a dreamer, a spirit walker. His dreams are visions. He does not see what is, but what will be and what must be." Corbin stared at the child, this small, wounded vessel of cosmic power. His mother came to him in a dream vision after the Ute. "Shot him," Tasawi continued, his voice thick with reverence. "She told him he would not die. She told him to follow the creek bed until he found a cabin belonging to a man with a spirit as broken as his own leg. A man with a hole in his soul that matched the hole in his own side. She told him this man, the Ghost Scout from Red Bluffs, would be his only sanctuary." Corbin could not breathe. He was not the boy's savior. He was a tool of a prophecy, a piece in a puzzle drawn by a ghost. His act of mercy was not his own. It had been ordained. Tookie looked at Corbin, his eyes holding not anger, not hatred, but a profound and unnerving understanding. He saw the grief Corbin carried for his own lost wife and son. He saw the festering wound of Red Bluffs. He saw it all. Then, the boy did something that shattered the world. He reached out his small brown hand, and he placed it gently on Corbin's bowed head. It was not a gesture of forgiveness. It was not a gesture of blessing. It was a gesture of connection, a closing of a circle, acknowledging a shared wound that ran deeper than blood, deeper than race, a wound of loss that bound the murderer's scout to the victim's son. In that moment, under the silent gaze of 70 warriors, 2 histories, 2 sorrows, 2 ghosts became one. Corbin felt a tremor run through him, a crack in the foundation of his guilt. He did not weep, but something inside him broke open. A dam of remorse that had stood for years. He wasn't being punished. He wasn't being forgiven. He was being seen. Truly seen, for the first time since Elspeth's death. And it was an agony and a grace beyond all comprehension. The reckoning was not what he thought. It was not about death. It was about a truth far more terrifying and far more sacred. They did not take him prisoner. They did not bind his hands. But he was taken all the same. Tasawi gestured with his chin, a silent command for Corbin to follow. 2 warriors helped Tiki onto a pony, his splinted leg resting stiffly across its withers. The boy's eyes never left Corbin as the silent procession turned and moved away from the cabin, swallowing him into its center. He walked. The riders formed a fluid, silent guard around him, their ponies' hooves making soft thuds on the plain's grass. It was not a march of a captive, but of an initiate being led into a mystery. He had left his rifle, his cabin, his entire life behind. He walked with nothing but the clothes on his back and the weight of the boy's hand still phantom-pressed upon his head. Their camp was hidden in a shallow wooded canyon miles away, a place the army patrols would never find. It was a small temporary village of hide lodges and cook fires, humming with a quiet, disciplined life. As they entered, people emerged from the lodges, women, old men, children. They stopped their work and watched the procession, their faces unreadable masks. Their eyes were all on Corbin, the white man, the ghost, who walked in their midst. There was no overt hostility, only a deep, penetrating curiosity. They were seeing a story unfold, a myth being born. They led him to the center of the camp, where a large fire pit had been dug. Tasohi stood before it and spoke to his people. His voice rose and fell in the cadence of the Comanche language, a story of pursuit, of a vision, of the man who had been an enemy and had become something else. Corbin didn't understand the words, but he understood their weight. He heard the names Tiki and Izatikuru repeated with reverence. He heard his own designation, the Ghost of the Llano, spoken with a new inflection. When Tasawi finished, a profound silence fell over the camp. Then the drumming started. It was a single large drum, beaten by 4 men with a slow, hypnotic rhythm that was the heartbeat of the earth itself. It was not a war drum. It was a ceremonial drum, a sound that spoke of things ancient and sacred. Women came forward and began to prepare taiki. They removed Corbin's wool blanket and shirt from him, replacing them with a new tunic of softly tanned deer hide, exquisitely beaded. They painted a yellow stripe, the color of the dawn, across his brow and cheekbones. Corbin watched, his own heart beating in time with the drum, and a cold dread filled him. He thought he understood. This was a funeral rite, a ceremony to mourn the part of the boy that had been touched by a white man, to purify him. Or worse, a preparation for a sacrifice, a final settling of the debt. The drums grew louder. Tuki, his face serene, was led to the fire pit. He walked with his painful limp, but his head was held high. He was no longer a child. He was a prince of his people, embodying a mystery Corbin could not fathom. He had to stop it. He had to offer himself. Corbin took a step forward, his voice a desperate croak. "Chief Tasawi, if a price must be paid, let it be mine. The boy is innocent. I am the one." A hand, firm as iron, gripped his arm. It was one of Tasawi's warriors, a man with a face like a weathered cliff. He didn't speak, but his eyes conveyed a clear message. "Be silent. Watch." Tasawi turned to Corbin, his expression not of anger, but of something akin to pity for his lack of understanding. "This is not about death, white man. Death is a simple thing. This is about the remaking of a story. A life was saved, but a fate was altered. That requires a new name." A fire was lit in the pit. The flames leaped high, casting flickering, dancing shadows across the faces of the assembled tribe. The drums pulsed. The world narrowed to this circle of fire and sound and humanity. Tuki walked to the edge of the fire, the light illuminating his painted face. He turned, not to his father, but to Corbin. And then, for the first time, the boy spoke to him. His voice was not a child's whisper, but clear and strong, carrying over the beat of the drums. He spoke in Comanche, a short, rhythmic phrase. Tasawi translated, his voice low and filled with awe. He says, "The man with the quiet hands gave me water when my spirit was leaving my body. He carries the ghost of his own son in his eyes." The boy spoke again, his voice rising, pointing a small, steady finger at Corbin. "He listens to the silence that comes after a scream," Tasawi translated. "He hears the words that are not spoken. He built a fire not to burn, but to warm. His guilt is a clean guilt, a stone he has carried until it is smooth." Taiki took a deep breath, his small chest swelling. He shouted his final words into the fire-lit night, his voice ringing with an unassailable authority. Tasawi looked at Corbin, and for the first time, Corbin saw not a grieving father or a weary chief, but a man witnessing a profound act of spirit. "My son, the dreamer has given you your new name," he said. "You are no longer the ghost of the Llano. From this day until the day your spirit walks the sky road, you are Antiesor." Corbin stared, uncomprehending. "What does it mean?" Tasawi's gaze was heavy, a burden in itself. "It means the one who listens to silence. It is not a gift. It is a title, a duty. You are now a part of this story, our story. The silence you hear is the pain of our people, the memory of our dead, the prayers of our children. You are now bound to listen to it, forever." It was not an execution. It was not an offering. It was something far more profound, something irreversible, a sacred binding that transcended his own culture's comprehension of justice or forgiveness. He had come expecting a fire of retribution. Instead, he had been branded by a fire of sacred naming, marked for life by the child whose mother he had watched die. He was no longer just Corbin. He was a man with a Comanche soul name, a name given in a language he did not speak, for a reason he was only just beginning to understand. He did not stay with them. To do so would have been a lie, an attempt to become something he was not. He was Netazor, but he was still Corbin. He was a bridge, and a bridge must have its feet on two separate banks. After the ceremony, after the drums had faded and the fire had burned down to glowing embers, Tosawi walked with him to the edge of the canyon. The dawn was breaking, the same dawn that had brought the riders to his door, but it felt like a different sun, a different world. "My son's vision is complete," Tosawi said, his voice softer now, weary. "He saw you not as an enemy, but as a turning point. An answer to a prayer his mother made as she died. A prayer that one of you would see." Corbin finally looked the chief in the eye. "I saw," he said. "Too late." "No," Tosawi said, shaking his head. "Just in time for him." He handed Corbin a small deerskin pouch. Inside was dried meat, a piece of flint, and the small, carved wooden bird from Tiki's pouch. "A gift for the road." "Your cabin is as you left it," the chief said. "No one will harm you. You are marked now. You are known to us. You listen to the silence. And sometimes the silence may have need of you." It was a dismissal and a commission all at once. Corbin turned and walked away from the Comanche camp, back toward a life that was his and yet no longer his alone. He did not look back. He found his cabin undisturbed, the cold coffee cup still on the porch rail. For months, his life returned to its old rhythms, the trap lines, the solitude, the quiet turning of the seasons. But everything was different. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with meaning, with presence. When the wind rustled the pines, he heard whispers. When a hawk cried overhead, he felt a gaze upon him. He was a man living inside a story, and he could feel its unseen authors watching him. He was no longer a ghost, hiding from the world. He was a guardian of a memory, a keeper of a name. He had been given not peace, but a purpose, a burden that was also a strange and solemn form of grace. He had begged for punishment and been given a sacred duty instead. One morning, nearly a year later, he found a single perfect hawk feather lying on his doorstep. It hadn't been there the night before. It was a sign, an acknowledgement, a reminder. He picked it up, the filament soft against his calloused fingers, and tucked it into the leather band of his hat. He walked to the edge of the ridge overlooking the vast plains, the place where he had first seen the blood trail. The land stretched out before him, immense, ancient, and silent, but he could hear it now. He could hear the whispers on the wind, the memory in the stones, the heartbeat of the earth beneath his feet. He had become what the boy had named him. He had not saved a tribe. He had not redeemed his own soul. Such things were too large for one man. But he had faced the ghosts of his past and had not flinched from their judgment. He had opened his door to an enemy, and in doing so, had found a connection more profound than kinship. On the canyon wall, where the old ones had carved the spirals of their journeys, a new mark would one day be found by those who knew how to look. Not a picture, but a story, whispered from father to son around a winter fire, a story of the white man who was given a Comanche name. A story that would end, always, with the same quiet truth, a truth written on the wind and etched into the heart of the land itself. He gave what the others never did: time and blood and silence.